It was a cool autumn evening in Atlanta, Georgia. The sun had just dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the busy streets as people hurried home after another workday. The sound of car engines and distant voices filled the air, blending together into the familiar hum of the city. For Judge Natalie Rivers, a respected member of the legal community, it was the end of another long week. The cases had been particularly draining that day, but she was relieved to be heading home. Natalie, a sharp and principled judge, had built a career on holding criminals accountable and ensuring justice was served. She was known for her no-nonsense approach, and her peers admired her for her fairness and resolve. Yet, despite all her accomplishments and the respect she had earned, she knew that her identity as a black woman often placed her in situations where that respect was questioned. As she drove her black Lexus down the quiet suburban streets toward her home, she thought about her weekend plans. Her son, Elijah, had just returned home from his first semester of college, and they were looking forward to spending quality time together. The thought of having him back under the same roof brought a smile to her face. She missed their late-night talks and the warmth of his presence. However, her peaceful thoughts were interrupted when she saw the flashing blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. A sharp jolt ran through her chest. She quickly reviewed the usual checklist in her mind: seatbelt fastened, speed limit observed, no illegal turns, and yet, she knew this moment would be far from typical. She pulled over, her heart racing as the officer approached. She glanced at him through the side mirror, a young man, probably in his late 20s, with a look of arrogance in his stride. As he got closer, his hand rested casually on the handle of his holstered gun. The familiar tension started to build in her stomach. As much as she wanted to believe that her position as a judge would protect her from such moments, experience had taught her otherwise. When he reached her window, she rolled it down, keeping her voice steady. "Evening, officer. Is there a problem?" The officer, whose badge read McNair, didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gave her a slow, scrutinizing look before speaking. "License and registration, ma'am," he demanded, his tone cold and detached. Natalie handed over her documents without hesitation. She had done nothing wrong, and she had no reason to hide anything. As McNair examined her license, he paused. "Judge Rivers," he said, his voice slightly softer but still laced with condescension, "do you know why I pulled you over?" She met his gaze evenly, feeling a slight unease building. "No, officer. Could you tell me?" He smirked. "You were speeding and didn't make a full stop at the intersection back there." Natalie's frown deepened. She knew she hadn't been speeding, and she always came to a complete stop at intersections. But she also knew that arguing would get her nowhere. This wasn't just a traffic stop. It was a reminder of the larger battle against the systemic biases that continued to plague society. "I see," she said, keeping her voice calm. "I must have been distracted." McNair seemed momentarily thrown off by her composed response. His eyes scanned the inside of her car, as if searching for any excuse to escalate the situation. He stood there for a moment before making his next move. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered abruptly. Natalie's heart skipped a beat. "Is that necessary, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with disbelief. "Step out of the vehicle. Now," McNair repeated, his voice firm. Reluctantly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out of the car. She stood by the hood, watching as McNair began to search her vehicle, opening compartments and checking the trunk. The tension was palpable. Was this really about a minor traffic violation? Or was it about something more? Was it about her being a black woman driving a luxury car? The knot of injustice twisted in her stomach. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a reminder of the unfairness that so many people faced on a daily basis. Minutes passed, and McNair found nothing. His face remained unreadable as he handed back her license and registration. "You're free to go," he muttered, though the ordeal was over. The anger simmered beneath Natalie's calm exterior. She had done nothing wrong, yet she had been treated with suspicion. As she got back into her car, her hands trembled slightly. She hadn't been just pulled over, she had been reminded of the systemic racism that still pervaded even the most respected institutions. "Is that all, Officer McNair?" she wanted to ask, but instead, she just drove away. The encounter was over, but the injustice lingered. It was a battle she had fought her entire career. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it wasn't just a statistic. It was real. The next morning, as the sun crept over the horizon, Natalie sat in her kitchen, sipping her coffee. Her son Elijah came downstairs, rubbing his eyes. "Morning, Mom," he said, smiling. He could sense something was off, but he didn't say anything. "Morning, sweetheart," she replied, her voice quiet but resolute. The storm was gathering, and she knew it wouldn't pass easily. But she wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. The hours that followed the traffic stop weighed heavily on Judge Natalie Rivers. She had tried to push the event from her mind as she worked through her usual tasks. But it lingered, like a dark cloud hovering over her thoughts. She had been through countless cases involving systemic bias, police misconduct, and racial profiling. But this was different. This wasn't just another case in a courtroom, it was her own experience. And it had shaken her to the core. Later that evening, after a quiet dinner with Elijah, she sat alone in her study. The weight of the situation hung over her like a constant pressure in her chest. She replayed the encounter with Officer McNair over and over again, seeing it from every angle. The way he had approached her, the smug look on his face, the subtle but undeniable tension in the air. She knew she had been calm and professional, but inside, she was enraged. She had spent her entire career fighting for justice, ensuring that the law was applied fairly and equitably. But what had happened on that road, in that moment, was a clear reminder that the very system she had worked so hard to uphold still had glaring flaws. She was a judge, a respected legal professional, and yet she had been treated like a criminal, simply because of the color of her skin. Elijah had seen the change in her. He noticed how quiet and distant she had become, even as they shared dinner. He was a smart young man, and he could sense when something was weighing on her. He looked up from his phone, his voice tentative. "Mom, are you okay?" Natalie looked at him, a faint smile pulling at the corners of her lips. She didn't want to burden him. Not tonight, but she could see the concern in his eyes. And that made her hesitate. "I'm fine, Elijah, just thinking about something." Elijah was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. "Is this about the cop? What happened?" He didn't wait for her to answer, his voice growing firmer. "You shouldn't have to deal with that. No one should." Natalie felt a tightness in her throat. Her son was right. He shouldn't have to worry about his mother being treated like a suspect because of the color of her skin. "I know, Elijah, it's not just about me. It's about the fact that this happens every day to people who don't have the platform I do. People who don't have the legal knowledge or the resources to fight back. That's what bothers me the most." Elijah looked at her, his expression a mixture of pride and frustration. "What are you going to do about it?" Natalie took a deep breath, her mind already racing. She had been thinking about this all evening. And now, with Elijah's words hanging in the air, she knew what she had to do. I'm going to speak out. I can't let this slide. Not when it's bigger than just me. She stood up, pacing around the room as her thoughts began to form into action. She had a reputation for being unyielding in the pursuit of justice. And that hadn't changed. What had happened to her wasn't just a random incident, it was a symptom of a larger issue. Systemic racism, police misconduct, a broken system that needed to be fixed. The next day, Natalie met with Marcus Washington, a civil rights attorney she had worked with on several cases. He was a close ally, a man who had fought alongside her for years, and she trusted his judgment. When she told him about the incident, his face grew serious. "This isn't just about a traffic stop, is it?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "No," Natalie replied, shaking her head. "This is about everything. The way this system treats people of color. The way it's built to protect itself while failing those it was meant to serve. I can't ignore this. I won't." Marcus nodded, his voice resolute. "I'll help you file a formal complaint. But you know this is going to get messy. The system doesn't like to be called out. But if anyone can do it, it's you." Natalie looked at him, her resolve hardening. "I'm ready for whatever comes. It's time to hold people accountable. We can't let this keep happening." The following week, Natalie filed the complaint against Officer McNair, detailing the entire traffic stop, the way he had treated her, and the lack of any legitimate reason for pulling her over in the first place. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and that the pushback would be swift, but she had spent her life in the courtroom, watching as people of color were often treated unfairly by the very system meant to protect them. This was her chance to challenge that system, no matter the cost. As soon as the complaint was filed, the media caught wind of it. Natalie knew that the public eye would now be on her, and that the story would quickly become a flashpoint. Some would rally behind her, others would condemn her actions. The storm was beginning to gather. One afternoon, Natalie sat in her office at the courthouse, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she drafted a statement for the press. She was about to speak publicly for the first time about the incident, and she knew it was important to choose her words carefully. Her phone rang. It was Marcus. "Have you seen the news?" he asked, his voice tense. "The story's already starting to make waves." Natalie glanced at her computer screen. She saw her name in bold letters across the headlines: Judge Rivers files complaint against officer for racial profiling. It was happening faster than she had anticipated. The public was already reacting, and she could feel the weight of their judgment. Her phone buzzed again, this time a message from Elijah. "Mom, be careful. I'm seeing some pretty nasty comments online already." Natalie took a deep breath and put her phone down. The backlash had already started, and she knew it would only get worse. But she wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. Later that evening, she sat with Elijah in the living room, watching the news coverage unfold. They had prepared for this moment, but the reality of it was still overwhelming. As the reporter discussed the complaint and the possible outcomes, Elijah turned to her. "Do you think this will actually make a difference?" "Mom," Natalie smiled at him, though her eyes were tired. "I don't know, Elijah, but I'm not doing this just for me. I'm doing it for everyone who's been pushed to the side. Everyone who's had to suffer in silence because they didn't have a voice. If we don't speak up, who will?" The days following Natalie Rivers' formal complaint were a whirlwind. The news spread quickly, and the media coverage was immediate. Headlines flashed across news outlets. Social media was ablaze with comments, and opinions were divided in the city. Some were supportive, applauding her courage in speaking out against police misconduct, while others condemned her actions, accusing her of playing the race card, and stirring up unnecessary controversy. As the story gained traction, the criticism grew louder. The backlash was as expected. A judge accusing a police officer of racial profiling was bound to shake the foundation of the very system that many depended on. The police union issued a public statement condemning her complaint, claiming that Officer McNair was simply doing his job and that there was no evidence to support her claims of racial bias. But Natalie wasn't surprised by the backlash. She had known it would come. She had spent enough time in the legal system to understand the dynamics at play. She had seen firsthand how difficult it was to challenge a system designed to protect itself. But she also knew that this fight wasn't just about her, it was about something much bigger. At home, Elijah was constantly on his phone, scrolling through the latest comments. He was trying to shield his mother from the worst of it. But the hurtful words still found their way to her. "Mom, you're trending on social media," he said one evening, his voice tense, and not in a good way. "People are calling you a troublemaker, saying you're just trying to make things worse." Natalie leaned back in her chair, looking at her son. He was angry, and she could see the worry in his eyes. She had always tried to shield him from these kinds of harsh realities. But now, it was impossible. The attack wasn't just on her, it was on everything she had fought for. And the world was watching. "I know, Elijah," she said, her voice steady, "but if we don't speak out, nothing will change. We can't keep ignoring these issues and pretending everything is fine. It's not just about me. It's about all the people who don't have a voice." She saw her son nod slowly, though his worry didn't fade. "I just hate seeing you go through this. I know you're doing the right thing, but it's hard to watch. You're getting so much hate, and I don't want to see you hurt." Natalie smiled softly, trying to reassure him. "I'm used to it, Elijah. You learn to let it roll off your back. But that doesn't mean I'll stop fighting. This is bigger than us. This is about making sure that no one else has to go through what I went through." Meanwhile, Marcus Washington, her trusted civil rights attorney, was already preparing for the legal battle ahead. He knew that filing a formal complaint wasn't just the first step. It was the beginning of a much longer process that would likely involve legal hearings, public scrutiny, and, inevitably, more pushback. He called Natalie one morning, his voice professional but tinged with concern. "Have you thought about how this is going to affect your career?" "Natalie, the heat is already on, and the media is relentless. I'm just worried about what this could do to your reputation." Natalie paused for a moment, considering his words. She had known this wasn't going to be easy. As a judge, her credibility and reputation were everything. But this wasn't just about her, it was about making a stand for justice, even if it came at a personal cost. "I've thought about it, Marcus, but I'm not backing down. If I let this slide, then I'm just as complicit as everyone else who stays silent. If I can't challenge this now, what message am I sending to my community? To my son?" Marcus sighed, though she could hear the respect in his voice. "I get it, but be prepared for the storm. This isn't going to be an easy fight, and we're going to need all the support we can get." As the days passed, the pressure on Natalie only intensified. News outlets began digging into her past, analyzing her rulings, her professional history, and even her personal life. The police department released a statement defending Officer McNair, and many of her colleagues were hesitant to speak out in support of her. Some feared the backlash themselves, while others remained neutral, hoping the situation would blow over. But Natalie wasn't one to back down. She began preparing for the next steps in her fight. She knew this wasn't just a fight for accountability, it was a fight for reform. for change in the police force and the justice system as a whole. And she wouldn't rest until that change was made. Late one night, after hours of preparing legal documents and organizing her thoughts, Natalie received a message from Reverend Sarah Hughes, a prominent civil rights leader in Atlanta. The Reverend had been following the case closely and had been vocal in her support for Natalie's cause. Judge Rivers. The message read, "I've been watching your fight closely, and I want you to know that we stand with you. This is bigger than one officer. It's about all the people who've suffered because of systemic injustice. I'm organizing a rally, and I'd be honored if you could speak. We need your voice." Natalie read the message over twice before responding. She had known that this fight would require more than just legal action. It would take the voice of the community to make real change. She wasn't sure she was ready to take the stage in front of hundreds, maybe thousands, of people. But she knew this was an opportunity she couldn't pass up. "I'll do it," she typed back. "I'll speak at the rally. Let's do this." The next few days were filled with preparation. Natalie spent hours rehearsing her speech, refining her message. She knew this wasn't just about her experience. It was about the experiences of so many others who had been silenced for too long. She wanted to make sure her words were clear, that they resonated with everyone who had been affected by the injustice of the system. As the day of the rally drew closer, the media attention continued to intensify. It felt as though the entire city was watching. And while there was still a significant amount of negativity surrounding her case, the tide of support was growing. People were starting to stand behind her, not just as a judge, but as a symbol of resistance, of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. When the day of the rally finally arrived, Natalie stood backstage, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound of the crowd chanting for justice echoed in the distance, and she felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for. She stepped onto the stage, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of hope. This was bigger than one officer. This was about a movement, and she was ready to lead it. The day of the rally arrived in a whirlwind of anticipation and nervous energy. Atlanta's streets were alive with people, activists, community leaders, and concerned citizens, all gathered in one place, united by the same cause, justice. The air was thick with excitement and a sense of urgency. It was a protest, a call for change, but also a celebration of the power of the people to demand their voices be heard. The movement had gained momentum, and Natalie Rivers was now at the forefront of it all. As she stood backstage, her palms slightly sweaty and her heart racing, Natalie took a deep breath. She had faced plenty of tense moments in courtrooms, but this felt different. Today, she wasn't just a judge. She wasn't just a person making a ruling on a case. Today, she was a symbol, a beacon for the change the community had been calling for. The crowd outside was waiting for her to speak, to share her truth. She wasn't sure how the world would react, but she was certain of one thing: she couldn't back down. Elijah, who had come with her, stood by her side. He seemed more confident now, though there was still a worry in his eyes. "You've got this, Mom," he said, squeezing her hand. "I'm proud of you." Natalie smiled at him, though her nerves still threatened to take over. She had spent so many years fighting battles in courtrooms, but standing before thousands of people was a new kind of fight. "Thank you, Elijah. It's not just for me anymore. It's for everyone who's been ignored, silenced, and made to feel like they don't matter." The voice of the rally's organizer, Reverend Sarah Hughes, boomed over the loudspeakers, signaling that it was time for Natalie to take the stage. As Natalie stepped forward, the sea of faces before her felt almost surreal. They were all waiting for her to speak. She could feel the weight of their expectations. But it wasn't just her words they were waiting for, it was a movement. The people wanted to hear the truth. She stood at the microphone, looking out at the crowd, feeling the energy in the air. There were people of all ages, races, and backgrounds gathered in that park, standing side by side for one purpose, to demand justice. They weren't just fighting for one person, they were fighting for an entire community. "Thank you, Reverend Hughes," she began, her voice steady despite the thundering heartbeat in her chest. "Thank you to everyone here today for standing up, for speaking out, for fighting for the change we so desperately need." The crowd erupted into applause, and Natalie felt a surge of emotion. It wasn't just applause for her, it was applause for the truth that had been ignored for too long. She cleared her throat, the microphone slightly shaky in her hands. "I stand here today not just as a judge, but as a woman who has lived this. I stand here not just as a black woman who has been stopped for no reason, but as a person who has spent her life working within a system that, at times, fails those it is meant to protect." The crowd grew quiet, hanging on her every word. "Being a judge doesn't make me immune to the injustice that so many of us face every day." She continued, "The officer who pulled me over did so because of the color of my skin. Not because of anything I had done wrong. I was treated like a criminal, simply because I didn't fit the profile of what someone like him thought I should be." She could see the nods in the crowd, their understanding, their shared experience. Her words resonated with them. She wasn't just speaking about herself, she was speaking for all of them. "This fight isn't just about one police officer," Natalie said, her voice growing stronger. "This fight is about a broken system. A system that has allowed too many to suffer in silence. Too many to be mistreated. To be unfairly targeted. To be punished for things they didn't do simply because of the color of their skin." As she spoke, she could see the expressions on the faces before her, some hopeful, others angry, but all of them determined. This was the moment that would set the course for the future. The moment when people could no longer deny the reality that had been hidden in plain sight. "We are here today to say enough is enough," she continued. "We won't be silent. We won't be ignored. We will hold those who enforce the law accountable. And we will demand a system that truly serves justice for all." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Their voices loud, their unity undeniable. It was a sound that filled the air with hope, with the promise of change. Natalie felt the energy surge through her. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for a community that had been silenced for far too long. As she finished her speech, she stepped back from the microphone, her heart racing. She had done it. She had taken that first step. And now there was no turning back. Elijah rushed to her side, his eyes wide with pride. "You were amazing, Mom," he said, pulling her into a hug. "I knew you could do it." Natalie smiled, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. This was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and the challenges would be many. But today, in front of this crowd, something had shifted. People were listening, the movement was growing, and Natalie knew that this fight, her fight, was far from over. That evening, as she sat at home with Elijah, the news coverage flooded her living room. The rally had been broadcast across the city, and the media was now paying attention. There was an undeniable shift in the narrative. People were finally starting to understand. But with the attention came the backlash. The police union and critics had already begun their campaign to discredit her. "You know it's just the beginning, right?" Elijah asked, his voice laced with concern. "They're going to come for you. The police, the media, they won't stop until they try to tear you down." Natalie looked at her son, a quiet resolve settling in her chest. "I know, but we've started something. We've made people listen, and that's all that matters." She knew the fight was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning, but for the first time, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She wasn't alone in this fight, and together, they would make a difference. The days following the rally were filled with mixed emotions. On one hand, Natalie Rivers felt a renewed sense of purpose. The crowd's energy, their collective call for justice, had fueled her resolve. She had taken a stand, no longer just for herself but for an entire community. On the other hand, the media frenzy that followed was relentless. Her name was on every news channel, in every newspaper, but the stories were polarized. Some hailed her as a hero, a woman brave enough to take on the system. Others painted her as a villain, accusing her of playing the victim and stirring up division where none existed. The police union had stepped up their efforts, with press releases condemning her actions, claiming she was undermining law enforcement and disrespecting the work of officers like McNair. The tension was mounting, and Natalie could feel the pressure building every time she checked her phone or turned on the news. But she had long been prepared for the backlash. As a judge, she had learned to deal with public scrutiny. Even if this was different, this time, the attacks were personal, and she knew that as much as her words had inspired people, they had also made powerful enemies. Despite this, she remained resolute. That evening, as she sat at her kitchen table, Elijah joined her, his face marked with concern. He had been watching the news, reading the comments, and trying to protect his mother from the worst of it. But he knew the storm wasn't going to blow over. "Mom, I've seen the threats," he said quietly, sitting across from her. "Some of them are pretty serious. I don't want you to go through this alone. I'm worried." Natalie looked at him, her heart heavy with the realization that this wasn't just her fight, it was his too. "I know, Elijah, I'm worried too, but we can't back down. We can't stay silent just because it's uncomfortable. This fight is bigger than both of us. It's about creating a future where you don't have to worry about these things. About living in a world where people are judged by their actions, not their skin color." Elijah hesitated but nodded. "I get it, Mom, I do, but that doesn't mean I'm not scared for you." Natalie reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "I know, sweetheart, but we're stronger than fear. And we're not alone in this. We have each other, and we have a community behind us. People are listening. Elijah, we've started something, and together, we'll finish it." It wasn't just the public attention and threats that were weighing on Natalie, it was the slow, grinding process of the legal battle that lay ahead. Filing a formal complaint against Officer McNair had been just the first step. Now came the long, grueling process of dealing with internal affairs, legal hearings, and the inevitable slow pace of justice. Natalie knew this could take months, even years. The system was notoriously slow, and the police department was resistant to change. But she had no intention of letting this go. A few days after the rally, Marcus Washington called her with an update. "I've had some conversations with the Internal Affairs Office," he said. "They're dragging their feet on this. You're not going to get a swift resolution. But we're pushing. We're not going to let them sweep this under the rug." Natalie knew that Marcus was right. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and the system had a way of protecting its own. She had been in enough courtrooms to understand that. But this time, she wasn't just another person waiting for a ruling. This time, she was determined to make sure the truth came to light. A week later, as Natalie was preparing for another day in court, she received an unexpected phone call. It was from Reverend Sarah Hughes. "Judge Rivers," Reverend Hughes said, her voice warm but urgent. "I've been following your case closely, and I want you to know that you have our full support. We're organizing a march to keep the pressure on the police department and show the city that we're not backing down. We want you to speak again, to remind the people that this is far from over." Natalie took a deep breath, the weight of the request settling over her. She hadn't expected to speak again so soon, but she knew that this was another crucial moment. The movement was growing, and people were rallying around her cause. "I'll be there," she said, her voice steady. "This fight doesn't stop now. It won't stop until real change comes." The march took place 2 weeks later, and the energy in the air was electric. Hundreds of people gathered, chanting for justice, holding signs that read, "Justice for all and end racial profiling now." It was a peaceful demonstration, but the message was clear: they were not going to be silenced. Not when there was so much work left to do. When Natalie took the stage once again, the crowd erupted into applause. She could feel the weight of their expectations. But this time, she felt more confident. The battle had been tough, but now she was no longer just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had been treated unjustly, for everyone who had suffered under the weight of systemic racism. "I stand before you today," she began, her voice loud and clear, "not just as a judge, but as a woman who has experienced this injustice firsthand. What happened to me, what happens to so many of us, is not isolated. It is part of a larger pattern, and we cannot afford to ignore it any longer." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. "I know the system is broken, but we can fix it. We can demand accountability. We can push for change. And we can stand together, united, until that change is made." The crowd cheered, their voices a chorus of determination. Natalie felt a surge of hope. This was no longer just about one officer, one complaint. This was about an entire movement, a movement that had the power to change the system. The march continued into the night, the streets alive with energy and hope. Natalie walked beside Elijah, feeling the weight of the day's events but also a sense of victory. She knew the road ahead would be long, and the challenges would continue to pile up. But for the first time, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. The people were with her, and together, they could achieve real change. That night, as they returned home, Natalie sat at her desk, reviewing legal documents and preparing for the next steps in the fight. There was still so much to do. The hearing against Officer McNair was fast approaching, and the pressure was mounting. But she had taken a stand, and now, there was no turning back. As she sat there, Elijah came into the room, holding a cup of tea. "You okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice gentle. Natalie looked up, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I'm more than okay," she said softly. "We've started something big, Elijah, and we're not stopping until we finish it." In this final chapter, Natalie continues her fight for justice, gaining even more support from the community and civil rights organizations. Despite the mounting challenges, both personal and professional, she remains steadfast in her resolve. The march represents a turning point in the movement, showing that the battle for systemic change is far from over but has gained significant traction. Natalie's strength and determination inspire those around her, and she knows that, together with her community, real change is within reach. This marks the conclusion of the story, but the movement is just beginning. Would you like to explore another part of the story or make any adjustments?